Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Margaret Mims from the Department of Learning and Interpretation here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. Tonight, we kick off a three-part lecture series celebrating three amazing Houston women and the extraordinarily significant roles that they played in building the collections here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and perhaps equally as important, their visionary roles in building the vibrant cultural, intellectual, and civic life of our city. Our lecture series here at the museum is part of a larger citywide celebration of women organized by the Houston History Alliance to champion the many ways that Houston's women have, are, and will put their mark on local, national, and global history. This citywide collaboration is called Tales of Houston Women, includes 21 organizations throughout our city, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, of course, being one of them. All 21 of these organizations are creating programs that provide their own perspective on how Houston women rock the world. I must say, though, that trying to focus on only three women who played seminal roles in the formation, development, and legacy that has become the Museum of Fine Arts Houston was a really tough challenge, since it was women who actually founded the organization that became the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and have been at the forefront of its growth ever since. For this series of three lectures, we focus on Annette Finnegan, Audrey Jones-Beck, and Ima Hogg. Tonight, though, we turn to the early part of the 20th century and the remarkable impact that Annette Finnegan had on our city and on our museum. To introduce us to this energetic suffragette leader, astute businesswoman, and visionary philanthropist, I'm very pleased to welcome author and historian Betty Trapp Chapman as our speaker. For the past 25 years, Betty's passion has been researching, teaching, and writing about the history of Houston. From 1993 to 2013, she wrote the weekly Houston Business Journal column titled Houston Heritage. Her other published works include 2-minute histories of Houston, Houston Women, Invisible Threads in the Tapestry, 100 Years, 100 Stories, the Houston Public Library from 1904 to 2004, Historic Photos of Houston, and Rough Road to Justice, the Journey of Women Lawyers in Texas. She's the past chair of the Houston Archaeological and Historical Commission. She served on the boards of the Heritage Society, the Preservation Houston, Houston History Association, and Friends of the Texas Room, and currently serves on the advisory board for Houston History Magazine. It was Betty Trapp Chapman who approached me months ago as the Houston History Alliance was putting together the Tales of Houston Women collaboration to see if the museum would be interested in creating programs in conjunction with this initiative. Well, when I found out that she was deeply immersed in writing a book, not yet published, on Annette Finnegan, who may not be a household name in Houston, but is certainly well known for the museum staff and docents, given the tremendous impact of her gifts on the museum, well, it was easy. A lecture series was born. So please join me in welcoming Betty Trapp Chapman as our speaker this evening.
I am delighted and pleased to be here tonight to talk about Annette Finnegan. I have friends who will be very glad that I've been invited to do this because many of them are weary of hearing me talk about her because she is not a name that is well known in Houston. And I hope that we can remedy that when we learn more about her. I first encountered Annette Finnegan 30 years ago, in fact, almost this month. I received a phone call from someone in Austin, and she said she was putting together a session of the Texas State Historical Association for the following February, March. And she wanted to do it on three women who had been activists in the three cities in Texas, and asked if I would do Annette Finnegan to represent Houston. And I said, who is Annette Finnegan? And I quickly learned who Annette Finnegan was. And I've been passionate about telling her story ever since, because she was an extraordinary woman. And of course, tonight we're going to look at her gifts to the museum. But we're also going to look at a woman who had an extraordinary life in so many, many different areas. So with that, we will begin. And this is going to be a lot of the story of Houston too, because Houston plays into so much of her life, and particularly that of her father. And so it will be a little bit of an immersion in Houston history as we talk tonight. This is an 1873 bird's eye map of Houston, when they, at that period, were doing maps of cities all over the country as they might look to a bird or from the air. But it gives us an idea of what Houston was in the 1870s. It had a population about 10,000. It was fast becoming a trade center. You can look at the map there and you see a boat or boats on the bayou. You see rail lines, because that's what Houston was about. It was a trade center. And that was going to help it develop and help it grow into what it has become today. Main Street didn't look very cityfied, though did it? Though we did have, by now, a four-story building, still dirt streets. But the major building in the community was the Market House, because the mercantile businesses filled Houston, and that was what the trade was all about. And as all of us know, Houston has always been a city driven by business. And business is what has made it grow and develop into what it is today in so many, many ways. So those were the buildings at the time that attracted a man named John Finnegan to come to Houston and try to make his mark as a businessman. So we're going to learn about the Finnegan family and how they happened to come to Houston. John and Kate Finnegan, and I'm fascinated by their story too, were Irish immigrants. John came as a small child, Catherine as a young teenager. Both families had immigrated to New Orleans, where they met and they married. And after the Civil War, John was orphaned at 15 and had to quit school. Annette often told the story because she and her father had a very close relationship, and he had a profound influence on her. But she would tell the story of how he entered the public schools in New Orleans the first day they opened. Well, I've done dates, and that is possible. I know when he came, because said education was very important to him. But he had to quit school. He did not get to go as far as he would have liked. And that's going to play a role in his daughters' lives, I think, very, very definitely. But they moved to Texas after the Civil War, to Brownsville, and where they had their first daughter. Then he decided, well, West Columbia looks like it might be a good place for me to move my hides business, which is what he had started. And so they go to West Columbia, and that is where the second daughter is born. And then by 1874, he looks at Houston, that I just showed you, and he said, I think that's where I need to be. I think that's where our future as a business will grow. So they moved to Houston. And these are the three daughters, Catherine, Annette, and Elizabeth. And I've given you the names that they used in the family. And apparently, I did not run into Annette being called Nettie as I explored her life. But as adults, Daisy and Bessie, you did use those names. So these were the three Finnegan daughters. Annette is the middle daughter, and she is the one that we're going to focus on tonight. They attended public schools, which were brand new in Houston. They had just been really started in 1877, but that is where they were schooled in those early years. They had primary, grammar, and high school were the three divisions, and most of them were in kind of a reincarnation of this building, which is one of the first schools we had, called the Houston Academy. So this is where the girls were going to school. By the mid-1880s, Houston had grown. The population was now about 25,000. And not only had it grown in population, it was really expanding. And John Finnegan had done very well with his business. He had opened a New York office. And he decided, and of course I have none of this in writing, I'm just kind of surmising, another reason that he thought about going to New York, where he had the office, and take the family, is that it was going to provide greater opportunities for his daughters, particularly in education. So in 1888, the family moved to New York City. This is a picture of them, I think shortly probably after. That's done by a New York photographer. That is Annette on the left. She was 16 at the time they moved. Daisy at the top, Bessie the lower, and then Kate the mother on the right. So those are the females in the Finnegan household, and we're going to particularly follow Annette and what her life, the turns it took after they moved to New York and then back to Houston. She never felt like she ever lost her Texas residency. She always felt like a Texan, but she did spend a number of years at different stages in her life in New York City. Annette had finished 10 grades. Of course, the high school only went through 11 in Houston at the time. She had finished 10 and was really not prepared to enter a college at that time. So they had found Tilden Seminary in West Lebanon, New Hampshire, a very old school, established in 1855. I'm indebted to somebody in the audience tonight for finding it for me and getting a picture, because I had not been able to discover anything about it. But it was a very old school, very high scholastic standing, had students there from other parts of the country, and it was not an official feeder, I think, for some of the women's colleges for Wellesley, but it certainly served that purpose, because it would prepare young women to venture then into the college. And of course, education for women at that time was so very, very rare. It was not expected that a woman, I mean, much of society didn't feel a woman really needed to go study Greek or physics or anything like that, but what her role in life was going to be. And it was very controversial, very controversial. But these women's colleges particularly opened in the East, and they did attract young women who were interested in getting a higher education. And so Wellesley was chosen by the Finnegans as being where they would like Annette to enter as a freshman. So when she got to Wellesley, interesting, she was probably the only Texas student there her first year. And then, of course, she was listed actually the whole time she was at Wellesley as a New York resident, because that's where the family was living. But there were students at Wellesley at that time from 33 states and 4 foreign countries. So it was not just made up of Massachusetts young women. And interestingly enough, I read that the majority of the women who went were really middle class. You would think, gee, you'd have to be wealthy to send a daughter to Wellesley. It did cost for a boarding student $350 a year, $150 if it was a day student. And a lot of the students would work, you know, as serving or cleaning and doing those kinds of things in order to earn some of their board. But it's really interesting. I have every class that she took. I even know who her professors were, and that's rather interesting. She had, as you would expect, Latin, Greek, German, literature, art history, philosophy, but then you might not expect chemistry, physics, zoology, geology, a lot of science, and that's what you see at the top. That is a science class at Wellesley, well, one of the years that she was there. She is not in this photograph, but it is one of the science classes. She also took rhetoric, which was described as they did things like critique of literary masterpieces, and then their writing included argumentative composition, as in debating. And boy, did she really take advantage of that in her suffrage years. She was in the Art Society, which was named Tau Zeta Epsilon, and they had as their motto, the study of the beautiful wherever it is found. And she was in the Wellesley Bicycle Club, and she is in this picture. She is the 5th one from the right. She was tall. She was 5 feet 7.5 inches. I found that out on a passport. And she's there with, of course, they've all got caps on their heads. But she was rather athletic. She played tennis, and she was an enthusiastic biker in all those skirts. And women who were doing the biking at that time, this was called emancipated womanhood, because they were not doing something that was really ladylike in the Victorian era. And of course what they did, this is kind of beside the point, but what they did with all those skirts they had on is that they learned how to split them and make them into trousers so they could ride the bike. And there was, all of this came from an annual that I had access to, one of them that was during her years there. And there was a bike ad in there, and you, for $100, you could buy a lady's bike with pneumatic tires from a Boston firm. That was in the yearbook in 1894. So obviously there were women who were really out there being emancipated, and she was one of them there in the Wellesley Bicycle Club. She graduated in 1894. At that, there were 108 in her class, and at that time, 2% of all of the women in the United States between the ages of 18 and 21 were attending college. 2%. So when you think about her being one of the 2%, it was really rare. But John Finnegan really wanted those daughters educated, and he was going to see if he could, that it could be done. Then she went back to New York City, where her family was living. This shows John and Kate in, the photograph said Central Park. But anyway, they're living there, and he has his New York office. So what does he do with Annette? He trains her to run his office. Again, not something that young women were being trained to do at that time. She did other things in New York. She was interested in the settlement house movement, and she worked in that. She belonged to the Wellesley New York City Club. I think actually was secretary for that. She studied philosophy at Columbia. I don't know that she got a graduate degree, but she is listed in a Columbia publication as being part of that. So she did go study philosophy, and she was introduced to woman suffrage at Wellesley, in New York City, and which was the battleground for suffrage, not very much unlike Texas, which was not the battleground. But she became introduced to it there, and so it's going to have a really, really impact on her life. She did something, though, that she was not aware she was doing, that those of us in Houston today are very grateful that she did. You see the painting on the left that Thomas Flintoff, who came to Houston and went down the coast doing watercolors in 1852, and this is one of the Harris County courthouses that appeared then. Do you see the house in the picture? That is the house that belonged to William Marsh Rice, and then had passed on to, he had sold it actually to a real estate company when he left Houston. John Finnegan bought the house in 1885, rented it for a couple of years, and then the Finnegans lived in it a year. By that time, it had been moved. You know, we do a lot of that in Houston. If we don't tear it down, we'll try to move it so we can put something bigger on its lot. And so it was across from the courthouse, and that was due to be a commercial. So it was moved down the street a block to the corner of San Jacinto and Franklin, if you know where that is. And it stood there, and when the Finnegans went to New York, they rented the house actually to the Evershade family. And then, of course, lo and behold, that became prime property for a commercial building, and so it was going to be torn down again. And Annette Finnegan, and this comes from Rice University Archaeological Studies they did, was working in her father's office, and she said, you know, instead of tearing that building down, why don't we see if somebody will buy it? You know, let's put it up for auction, and they can move it. So that is what they did. They advertised in a Houston newspaper, and a couple, Emma and Dylan Cherry, went down. Mrs. Cherry was an artist, and she had always admired the surround of the front door, and so the Cherrys bid $25, thinking maybe they could at least get the door. Nobody else bid anything. So the Cherrys got the house for $25, provided they moved it, which they put it on a wagon. Took 46 days to move it to Montrose, but they got it moved, and the Cherrys lived in that house. If we fast forward a little bit, Mrs. Cherry was still living in the house in 1954. when she died. And then there was some time passed in there, but then the house was purchased and offered to the Heritage Society, which has the houses down in Sam Houston Park. Not that they ever intended to have a park full of houses, but when this one became available and was given to them, they very willingly took it. And it is now the Nichols Rice Cherry House. You notice it doesn't have the Finnegan name in it. When I took docent training years ago, they didn't even mention the Finnegans as having lived in the house. So maybe we've made discoveries more recently. But nevertheless, I credit Annette Finnegan with the reality that we have that house in Houston today. And what is really interesting is Emma Cherry and Annette Finnegan did not understand then how their paths were going to cross, which we'll get to in just a minute. These paintings are really interesting. They came to the city, probably when Kathy Whitmire was mayor, and a woman in Australia, Jean Salvato, called the mayor's office and said, I have some paintings, some watercolors that my grandfather got in England years ago, without realizing what he was really buying. He just bought a whole, case of things, and they came with it. I'm coming to Houston, and I'm going to bring those, and I'd like to show them to you. So Mrs. Salvato came. She had 5, and this was one of them, and she had one of the first market house. We had no idea what it looked like. There'd never been a description written of it at all. And then she had 3 of churches. She said, I will give, the one of the public buildings to the city, which she did, but she did not choose to leave the others because she really would like to have sold them. But she went back with the other 3. But since that time, there's one of Christ Church, which was the First Episcopal Church, and it now belongs to Christ Church down on Texas Avenue. Because I had written Mrs. Salvato to use one of the paintings in one of my books. And so I had her address, and I gave it to this couple at Christ Church who went to Australia and visited with her and bought the Christ Church painting and brought it back. Then there is one of the Presbyterian, the Methodist, and the Baptist churches that sat pretty much in a row if you were standing on Main Street. And actually, the ones that became very interested in that were the Presbyterians. It is at the front, the more prominent building in the picture. And they became interested, and they contacted Mrs. Salvato, and the one of the 3 churches now hangs at First Presbyterian Church. The third one was of the First Catholic Church here, and as far as I know, it is not in Houston, and I don't know anything about, anything in Australia. But I just think that's an interesting story about how things sometimes happen on the scene that you don't know anything about, and how we now have those paintings that were done in 1852 by Mr. Flintoff. Okay, they come back to Houston. They've stayed in New York all these years, and they come back, and Houston's changed. It's growing all the time, now 60,000. John Finnegan has 23 businesses, Hyde's businesses, throughout Texas, some in Oklahoma, the office in New York, Houston Packing Company, quite a large business. And the city is, of course, growing in size and in all kinds of ways. The one thing we're kind of lacking in Houston at that time, though, were the cultural things. And it really took the women to come forth and do those kinds of things. There is Emma Cherry. She's the one that bought the house, and was an artist, had been involved. She'd lived in Denver and had been involved with the beginnings of the Denver Art Museum. So when she moved to Houston, in 1900, Mrs. Cherry and 3 teachers, and I want to give you their names because often you don't see their names, just like Annette Finnegan. Lydia Atkinson, Kara Redwood, Roberta Cavender, and Mrs. Cherry called a meeting of women to come together, and they met at the home of Mrs. Lovett, Lavinia Lovett, and she lived at 2017 Main Street. That's where they met. And they met to organize a public school art league, which again was being done across the country as a way of putting art education into public schools. Because they felt it was very important. That was a part of a child's education they were not receiving, and that it was important for them to have it. So the Public School Art League was formed, had a large membership, almost entirely females. They began raising money. They would buy inexpensive art reproductions. They would go to the schools, give them to the schools, and then they would go teach about them. It was a really big effort on their part to get art into the schools. And then they decided they really wanted to have a really notable piece of art in one of the schools. So the ladies ordered Venus de Milo from Milan, Italy, not bronze or marble, it was plaster, but still it was a nice, representative of Venus de Milo, and they wanted to put it in the hallway of the high school. So they contacted the school board so they could make the presentation. And of course, the school board was all males, and they said, no way. No, they even said, we don't want to corrupt the morals of our students. So they turned it down. Well, the women weren't going to take that for an answer. So they went to Judy Idison, who was the new director of the new library that had just opened, and they asked her if she would take it. And she said, indeed, yes. And do you know where Miss Idison put Venus de Milo? Right behind the checkout desk where you got your books. There's a wonderful picture of her right behind the desk as all the women are lined up to check out their books. And Venus de Milo still resides at the Houston Public Library downtown because of that. And this shows you the library as it was in 1904. John Finnegan was one of the biggest donors to it. It's interesting, I had no idea what a big donation would be until I saw a list of figures. He gave $250, and that was considered sizable. Not the largest, but considered sizable. And I think he valued education. I interviewed a cousin 30 years ago when I was doing the paper. There was a cousin living here. I just wish I had spent a lot more time and asked more questions. I was preparing a 20-minute paper, and so, that's what I did. And she had told me how much John Finnegan valued education and books, that he was a great reader and had always, had been sorry he had not had more formal education. So he was considered a real donor to the library, and that's going to influence Annette Finnegan later in something that she does. And the thing, though, that the Finnegan daughters were most involved in when they came back here was to start a suffrage organization. So in 1903, they said, we're going to form the Houston Equal Suffrage League. They got a good turnout of women. They met in the Finnegan home most of the time. They brought national leaders down to do programs for them and to speak. They had some outdoor meetings. I mean, they were really thought they were tried to form a state organization. That never quite caught. They just couldn't quite keep it going. Texas did not have an active suffrage association at that time. There had been one in the 19th century in Texas, but it did not last. And so there was no real state movement. And so then when the Finnegan sisters decided to go back to New York, the suffrage effort fell through. One thing they had tried to do while they had it, though, was to have a woman named to the Houston School Board. And they were just terribly ridiculed for doing that. Just thought, why would you need a woman on the school board? And they told the reasons they thought women might bring something, particularly mothers might bring something to the school board in certain areas of the education, and that was not there. They did not succeed in that. And so that ended that part of the Suffrage Association here at the time. Then John Finnegan dies in 1909, leaves in his will that Annette is to be the manager of his estate because of her ability, her managerial training and her ability. She is to manage his estate. course, I've already told you the business. It was a vast, vast business. And they also owned the Hotel Brazos. She became president of the Hotel Brazos, where she resided. She and her mother lived there. This was one of the finest hotels in Houston at the time. It was located where well, it's not the post office downtown anymore, but if you know where the post office there on Washington, where Washington and Franklin kind of go together, that was where the hotel sat. It was right across from the Grand Central Depot, which was a wonderful location for a hotel. It had a tap room for gentlemen. It had a French chef. It had an orchestra, 250 rooms, and Annette actually incorporated two things into it. She had visited Europe. The family had made a trip there. That was her first trip there was with the family. And she had seen, these outdoor courts, and so so this became the Spanish court of the Brazos Hotel, which was a dining area, because she really wanted it to have a flavor of Europe. The other thing she did, which again says a great deal about where her thinking was, they had a policy that women traveling alone will be under the protection of the hotel, because she knew that there were some women who traveled, single women who traveled, and she wanted them to know that they were in a safe place when they stayed at the Hotel Brazos. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of her doing that. She did something else, and my friend Ann brought this to my attention in a publication several years ago. In 1911, Annette Finnegan bought a 1911 Persia great car that seated 5 people. Now, this is a woman buying that car. The cousin mentioned it to me when I interviewed her. She said she never drove, but she said she was just always right out there on the cutting edge doing things. And I think we just see this all through her life. I don't have a picture of the Pierce era. I wish I did. She became involved with the Social Service Bureau in Houston during these years, which was an outgrowth. Actually, many of their projects were an outgrowth of the Houston Settlement Association that had been formed in 1907 in the living room of Alice Graham Baker, who was usually known as Mrs. J.A. Baker. And these women knew there was a neighborhood in the Second Ward, large immigrant neighborhood, that did not have services it needed. It was greatly underserved. So that was why they formed the Houston Settlement Association. And the first settlement house was the Russ Settlement House that you see here. They had a wealth of activities. You see the children having an Easter egg hunt or story time. There was a branch of the library there. They had visiting nurses who went into the homes and helped with health situations or sanitary things. They taught English classes. It was just a widespread agency to work with the people in this neighborhood. Houston Settlement Association was eventually renamed Neighborhood Centers. It was recently renamed Baker Ripley, the largest nonprofit in Houston. And they say, there was an article recently that they serve 500,000 people every year. And Baker Ripley came out of the Houston Settlement Association in 1907. And I think that's a remarkable story for our community to know. She was a contributor to the Houston Symphony, because this was the time in 1913 they were trying to raise money to have an orchestra. Other cities had orchestras, and Houston just didn't understand why they couldn't fund one. And members of so many of the women's music clubs here came together, and Ima Hogg, as you see here, was a prime person in that. Ima Hogg was a highly trained pianist. And so anyway, Annette Finnegan's name is on that list of the contributors that they were doing so that they could have their first concert in 1913. And then Annette Finnegan realizes, okay, we need to get back to business. So in 1913, she reorganizes, and she is the primary one that brought it together, what they named the Women's Political Union. And that was going to be the local suffrage association in Houston. They had their work really cut out for them, and Annette Finnegan was very good at organizing, and so she was the president of the state association the next year. And she went all over the state forming clubs because they thought, we've got to have this every part of the state. We've got to have these suffrage supporters. The parade at the bottom, I'm not sure where it was. That came from the Daughters of the Republic Museum years ago when I used it. And they had no identification about where the parade was. But I think it's bound to have been a national parade because they're carrying a Texas. You see the Texas banner there in front of them. And the woman in the center there, the tall woman in the center in white, is Annette Finnegan. So she was really very, very active while she was still serving as president of the Hotel Brazos and doing all these other things. But suffragist was really, really her love, really at the heart of what she was doing. And so in the summer of 1915, her sister Bessie came from New York and stayed down here with her, and they went and spent the summer in Austin lobbying legislators. There's a letter, these papers are in the Austin History Center, and she had a letter that she gave or sent everyone running for a legislative position in the state of Texas, asking would they support a state constitutional amendment so that women would get the vote, you know, and it was a beautifully written letter. So then what she did, when they were in where she could really lobby them in person, she would really accost them. I started to say encounter, but she probably was really accosting them and saying, all right, I need your answer. And they have over in the Austin History Center a little thing where she wrote down what they said. And I've put some of them up there for you so you can see what some of the comments were. Most of them were negative. Occasionally they would get a positive one, but the amendment did not pass. I don't think it ever came to a vote. So they were still not where they needed to be in 1915, but still really, really working to get the vote for women. This battle had been going on since 1845 when the women, the first suffragists, met at Seneca Falls, New York. And, you know, Annette Finnegan and her fellow suffragists just didn't understand why it was taking so long. What was wrong with women having the vote? It was a tough battle, though. So anyway, I just thought that would be fun to see some of the replies that she got during that time. And just as they were really kind of coming maybe to a point where they might be able to move forward, Annette Finnegan suffered a stroke, very serious illness. It sometimes is called a paralytic-like illness, but most of the time it is called a stroke. I found that her health was not the best in the world, and at the rate she went, I'm sure, you know, she was maybe not tending to her health all the time. So she had to give up her business activities, any of you know, her suffrage, and so she was pretty much out of that, except she continued to support the suffragists very much financially. So let's go and pick up some things that were happening, though, during that time. We talked about the Public School Art League. It plugged along, and then I think in 1913 or 14, it became the Houston Art League, and they really were thinking, okay, we need to start collecting a permanent collection. We need a museum. We need a building. And so that began the thinking for what can we do. They would put, as they began, you know, some people would give them paintings, and it was mostly paintings. Some they'd hang at City Hall in the mayor's office, or they'd use people's residences or former residences. And one of them that they used is the house here on Main Street that belonged to Charles Shern House, the son of T.W. House, who was one of the very prominent businessmen early in Houston. And they used that temporarily for a while. And then they realized, you know, we really need to raise money. We really need our own building here. And on April 12th, 1924, the Museum of Fine Arts opened. At its opening, and it was the first in Texas, the third in the South. I got curious to know what number 1 and 2 would have been in the South, and I think I discovered just this afternoon before I came here that Atlanta was the first, New Orleans was the second, and Houston was the third. And so, you know, it took money. $200,000 is what this building cost. And the original design had two wings that they were not able to build immediately. They did fairly soon. But that day, they said that the comments were that it was built by the people of Houston for the people of Houston. And 1,000 people turned out that day. That some of them had to be turned away. There was no way 1,000 people could get in the building. But it was something the city had waited for and was so very, very pleased to have this museum. And of course, we're going to come back to the museum very soon and look at the collections that were given. But in the meantime, Annette Finnegan began traveling. She had the financial means to do it. She was impaired physically. It appears that her right arm was almost useless, and she did use a cane to walk. She had a companion who traveled with her, and she had a companion who had been the nurse of her children's sisters, her sister's children, and so she did have someone to help her. She began traveling, and she would just go, you know, and see the world. And while she was doing this, she thought, you know, I could really, really do some things for Houston. I could not only just go travel and see all this for myself, but I could supply them with things. So briefly, we're going to look first at what she did on her first trip in buying manuscripts for the Houston Public Library. This building had opened in 1926 as the new building from the one that I showed you earlier. Today we call it the Julia Addison Building, and it is where the Houston Metropolitan Research Center has its archives and its papers. She wanted to find manuscripts that would illustrate the art of bookmaking. Again, she would say, my father loved books. So this is where she went on her travels. She went to London, Munich, Budapest, Constantinople, going to book houses, finding things, and she found 65 items that dated from the 12th to the 17th centuries. A number of them were the illuminated manuscripts, which are just absolutely gorgeous, with the gold and then the ground stones that they used for painting. This is a Bible of William III's. You can read the dates, I don't need to tell you that. This is, of course, a binding, and they were just wonderful, too, as well as the inside Gothic lettering. And, of course, there was all of the artwork that was in them. The Book of Hours is considered one of the most beautiful books down there. It was 16th century. And, of course, most of these books were religious because they were created in the monasteries as early as the 6th century. And then by the 12th century, they were being done by universities. But they do most of these do have a religious theme. But the artwork, and of course, it's all done by hand. I mean, you know, you just can't imagine. Book of Esther was Hebrew, 16th century, the scroll. The Antiphonarium is interesting. It is a huge, huge songbook that a group of, it was used by Dominican nuns. This particular book has one of the nuns' names written on the inside cover. And but it was large enough that they could all stand and see the music in one place. They couldn't have individual songbooks. Heavens, you'd never get that many made when you were doing it by hand. And I love the square notes. They're kind of interesting to see too. Then the Fate of the Kings of Persia, 15th century. That is again a beautiful cover of one. And there are 5 Qurans in the collection. And this one is 15th century. But these are just some of the books that are in the special collections of the library downtown. Unfortunately, not many people know they're there. Not many people see them. Occasionally, some are exhibited. I think sometimes they have scholars come. They'd love to have scholars come and research them and study them. But they're just phenomenal. They really are. And again, it's something that a lot of us are not aware of as being there. Okay, we're going to move back to the Museum of Fine Arts. She realized during the 30s that we had this building, but money was scarce during those years, and there was not money to really buy collections. So she goes to Mr. Chilman, who is the director of the museum, and she says, I'm going to be traveling some more. What would you like to have? I will go find it. I will purchase it and I will send it back to you. And over the next 6 years, she sent back over 600 items. And we're going to look at just a few of them tonight. She would get the advice of experts. Sir Arthur Evans, the very famous archaeologist, who is bound to have been very, very old by then, but he gave her some advice when she was doing some of her Grecian objects. And I cannot give you any kind of literate comments or education on these things. I will tell you, maybe when we come to one, there's some on exhibit and there's some on permanent exhibit, and you can, if after this you want to go find them, that would be wonderful. You would really love seeing them. But anyway, so we're just going to go through. The first trip she made, she did collect Egyptian objects, and as I said, the information is there if you can read kind of fast, because I'm afraid I may be running out of time. And this one is in the Beck building. There are two galleries in the Beck building that has some of these objects. There's one in the law building, the Arts of India, that has some of the textiles on it in exhibit right now. But you can just see the different kinds of things. And of course, I'm just struck every time I look at those dates. I just can't imagine anything being from that age. And of course, this is the Egyptian, the model boat, the chest here. And then here we have another Egyptian jar with straight and curved lines. And then this is a Roman Egyptian item. And then she did make a trip to Greece. It's not the trip where she got most of the Greek things, but she did. And then she was also interested at that same time in going over to India and looking at textiles. She made, I figured, during the 30s, at least 6 trips. She stayed 32 months in one time, 10 another time, and she would just go out and shop and do careful research and send these things back. And in a minute, I'm going to show you one that there was newspaper articles. The only thing I wish she had done was kept a journal. Wouldn't it be wonderful if she had written down every time she bought something where she was and her experiences? Unfortunately, Annette Finnegan left no papers. I have 2 letters that were written by, other than suffrage materials, that were written by her. And of course the museum has wonderful records of this, but it would just be wonderful if we could know exactly what she was thinking and doing when she was doing all of this for the museum items. But she said she wanted the Houston Museum to be as wonderful as the ones she had seen in London and Berlin, and she thought that could happen. And that was really her goal, is that she wanted Houston to have what she was seeing in Europe. This is the one that when some of the Grecian objects came back in 35, I think, 36, I don't know. She made several trips during the 30s. And the article in the newspaper showed her sitting there, and they were unwrapping one of the boxes. And it's a very poor, I would have gone and scanned it and brought it. It's a very poor newspaper, reproduction of the article. But she was sitting there in her hat, and they were unwrapping, and the article described her as being anxiously watching. And I'm sure she wanted to be sure nothing had broken. But what she had done, according to this article, she had gathered these objects in different places, and then she had them all sent to London and gathered them in one place in London, and then packed them. And it mentions, the cardboard boxes and then the cotton batting, and I'm thinking, is that all they had to put these around? Then they were sent to Antwerp and then across on a boat to New York. So I would have been nervous too if I had been her, wondering, did they make that journey? But this is considered one of the really wonderful, wonderful pieces, and the picture in the newspaper shows her kind of resting her arms on that. and very relieved, I think, to know that it came out of the box all right. And of course, this is one of the real, I think, wonderful parts of the collection, is the gold laurel wreath that was symbolic of putting on, champions. It was usually greenery, but they would make them sometimes out of the gold for special, or then especially to put in with the deceased body. See, so many of these things were used in that way. Is what? And then this is still part of that same Greek collection. Mr. Chilman said to her, when she said, I want to go by for the museum, what would you like? He said, I would love to have a piece of marble. It can be small. I'd love to have a piece of marble. And I don't know whether he indicated Greek or not. But anyway, this is the piece of marble that she found, which of course is again one of the really, really wonderful things, the grave stele. And it's on exhibit up in the Beck building. There are 2 galleries over there, and it's there. And it says they're not sure whether the deceased is the mother or the infant. It's a mother and a servant and the infant, or whether it's both. That they don't know. But of course, it was on the grave of the person who had actually died. And it shows. The article also showed Miss Finnegan unpacking one of these. This is on view upstairs too in the Beck building. And it says that those 3 horses reflect, the labels with these pieces are just wonderful because they explain so well what they were used for. So I would encourage you, when you have time, go explore and see exactly what these were. The 3 horses implied the deceased was a man of wealth, or he would not have had horses, a large herd of horses. And this is one panel of a triptych which was used in funerals, and of course it is gold on wood, and of course it tells the whole story there of the Christian story there. I am so intrigued by this one. This is, I think, the oldest, isn't that right? This is the oldest piece in all of the collection that she sent back, and it is a marble figure from the Cycladic Islands in the Aegean Sea. I got curious and I went and looked them up. I didn't know there were 220 of them. I couldn't imagine 220 islands in one, but there are. And look at the date on it. There is no written record of any kind on it because there was no written record then. And the label upstairs will explain that to you. But again, it was something that would have been put in with the deceased. May even, so the label said, could represent a fertility goddess. But you look and see how very, very old. So, I just think she had a wonderful eye for things. And then, of course, she was getting help so that she was, finding the things that were really to be found. Jewelry, she sent back. A large collection of jewelry, and there are just 4 pieces here. The earrings with the goose pendants, and then here is a necklace and a bracelet. Then on one of her early trips, she was somewhere, I don't know where she was, and she sent a cable back to the museum, and she said, would you be interested in any textiles? That's not anything they'd ever talked about, but that just came to her while she was over there because she was in India, and she began seeing so many of these wonderful things. So this is just a small sampling of some of the textiles, the veil, the saris. This sari was on exhibit, was it a year ago? Yeah, and it is just magnificent. And when you can look up close at the weaving on that, it's just remarkable when you can realize that was done. Another piece of art. Tent panel, prayer mat, Indian. There are a lot of jackets, blouses, and trousers, things of that kind. Here is a blouse, a cushion cover. This is just a cover. I love the colors in it. I think they're so pretty. This is probably one of the earliest, it is the earliest I've got a photograph of. It's just a fragment of Turkish early 16th century with metallic thread. And, you know, it's amazing that even a sample of it has survived through this time. Here is a whole ensemble, Greek. And this is, I think, really interesting too. This tapestry for a bishop in Spain, 17th century. That is wool. And this is a chalice cover that is Spanish. She did have Spanish items. I don't know that I showed any of those, but she did do that too. So with 600 items, you can imagine how many countries, how many different things. I just kind of get amazed when I think about that. But she spent those years of her life doing that. The last collection was one of laces, and this was in 1939. And when it came back to Houston, supposedly, I looked this up in a newsletter recently over in the Hirsch Library here at the museum, and it said people were saying, "What is she doing getting laces? What's the point of that?" And they said, "Well, that is art too. Look at that lace. I mean, how wonderful it is." And Julia Idison, who was a good friend of Annette Finnegan, said, "I'm not surprised. You never saw her when she wasn't stylishly dressed. I would expect her to be attracted to laces." And so the lace collection came, and it had 64 pieces of lace dating to the 16th and 17th centuries. I think the handkerchief, yeah, that's gorgeous too, the borders, yeah. And this is a bohemian border. And that's a handkerchief. Would you dare use it? in that really, really gorgeous. And I love this because there were some pieces in what I was given to choose from of mantillas, but they weren't photographs that could be sent. And so I had cut this out. Remember the exhibit, like the Oscar de la Renta exhibit that was here not long ago? And that black mantilla on that figure, it says Annette Finnegan Collection. And I just kind of sent shivers over me to see it actually being exhibited. So the laces collection is unusual, but it's certainly art, certainly historic. And it was a collection that I think she was very proud of. On the 40th anniversary of the museum, which was in April 1940, they had an opening exhibit of the laces, and Annette Finnegan planned the exhibit, but it was installed by the former textile curator from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, who came and installed it and gave a lecture on the laces, and it was quite an event for the 40th anniversary of the museum. She did one last thing. That same year that she found the laces, she wrote the city of Houston, and she said, "I would like to give you 18 acres of land for a city park. I want it named for my father, and I want it to be in a neighborhood of black Houstonians because they do not have the parks." And at the time, there was only emancipation. And of course, we were in a totally segregated society at the time. And so she stipulated that this be done. And she said, "I'm going to give you $25,000 to improve the land and to have it ready as a park." And Finnegan Park, that picture was made, 2 weeks ago, is still a very active park in the city, named Finnegan. They don't use the John anymore. Named Finnegan Park because Annette Finnegan was thinking about others and what she could do for Houstonians. I think that was at the root. I'm sure she got a lot of pride and joy and in the scholarship that it took to do all of her collecting. But I think her bottom line was she really was doing this for the people of Houston, everything she did. And so that's kind of where I came up with the name Enlightening. And she enlightened people by the fact that she had gone to college. And everything she did was very much, I think, along that line. Annette Finnegan died July 17th, 1940, in New York City of cancer. I can't help but think she was probably not sick during that last trip. And, you know, war clouds were gathering. She came back in November 1939. And I would like to read you something that was said. That this is the very last thing I will do. This appeared in the Houston Post during that 40th anniversary. And it's a very long tribute to her and what she has done. Now I'm just going to pick out just these few sentences. Houston's Museum of Fine Arts is a monument to the determination of those Houstonians who believe the arts are as essential to well-being as pure air and sunlight. Among the art lovers who have made the museum possible, none has made a more significant or more valuable contribution than Miss Annette Finnegan. She has set a worthy example before the citizens of Houston for which future generations, as well as her own, will do her honor. And that acknowledgement expresses well the gratitude of an entire community to a public-spirited woman who is doing her best to prove that wars, violence, and political upheavals are but transitory phases of man's history, while objects of art, which reflect his destiny, are timeless and enduring. That could be written for us today, don't you think? She is buried at Glenwood Cemetery. It's a family plot there. And I can't help but think that she had some role in that wonderful monument there, because it looks like the Grecian feminine figure that she was so interested in from two standpoints, her art collecting and her suffrage activities. And I am trying to find out when it was put there and maybe how it came to be there. But I just think it's recognizes the beauty of what she brought to us in Houston. So I like to think of Annette Finnegan as a woman for all seasons. That may be the name of the book I'm working on. Not sure about that yet. As she moved from the season of receiving a college education to that of working so tirelessly to gain the vote for women, to becoming an astute businesswoman, and then finally to that of a generous, thoughtful donor of gifts that remain with us long after her death. She was truly an extraordinary woman, and I have so enjoyed telling you her story.
And we can hardly wait for the book. I just would love, I can hardly wait for the book now. That was just fantastic. I hope all of you will go and see some of the treasures that Miss Finnegan purchased on these travels. Imagining traveling as a woman in the 1930s when you couldn't fly anywhere. You had to take it by boat and carriage and no telling what else. But anyway, they're all, except for a couple of textiles that are in the Arts of India, which is behind the big hall right above us in this building. Just behind that hall is the Arts of India. The other works that are on view are in the Beck building, so go across the street. When you get to the first floor and you're in the atrium where there's the big donor wall with all the names on it, there's one opening directly across from you. In that first gallery, you'll see a lot of antiquities. That's the gallery where the gold myrtle wreath, really one of the prized possessions that Miss Finnegan bought, is on view in that gallery. And then there are other works you'll see on the label where it will say Annette Finnegan, but that one gallery would be where they are. And then on the very top floor in the atrium, because we don't really have permanent homes yet for antiquities, You'll see in a lot of the cases, the grave stele, the marble of the woman who died or her child died. That's on view along with other gifts of Miss Finnegan in a case, and a number of the Greek vases are on view. So they would all be in the atrium on the second floor. But I think, thank you again. This was truly a remarkable story. And I hope all of you will be here the next 2 Thursdays as our series continues. But thank you again, Betty Chapman.